The morning the dog appeared, the lake was frozen so far out, you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. Gord Fenwick. No, that name was taken. The man standing at the window of the old Fenwick property had a different name. His name was Sean Adler, and he had not spoken to another person in 11 days. He had counted, not out of loneliness, or so he told himself, pressing his palm flat against the cold glass. Out of habit. In the teams you counted everything. Days in country, hours since last contact, liters of water left in the bladder pack. Counting kept you honest about where you stood. 11 days. One trip into Minden for fuel and dog food for the dog he no longer had. He still bought the dog food. He hadn't figured out how to stop doing that yet. Sean was 53 years old and had spent 22 of those years as a Navy SEAL. He had done things, in places that didn't exist on any map his family could find. He had come home from those places mostly intact. A bad knee, a right ear that whistled in the cold, a way of sitting in restaurants with his back against the wall that his wife, Karen, used to tease him about. Karen. He let the name move through him the way cold air moves through an open door. Quickly. Completely. Taking everything warm with it. She had been gone 14 months. A tumor, fast and indifferent, the kind that didn't negotiate. She was there in March, laughing at something on the radio, her feet tucked under her on the couch, and by July she was not there at all. He had been present for every hour of it, which he had thought would help him later. It had not helped him. If anything, it had left him knowing exactly what was missing, the way you always notice a tooth more after it's gone than you ever did when it was there. After the funeral, his daughter Priya had asked him what he was going to do. He'd said he was going to go to the property. She'd looked at him the way she used to look at math problems she didn't trust. Which property? Your grandfather's. On the lake. In Halliburton. She hadn't argued. She knew better than to argue with him when his voice got that flat, informational quality. She'd hugged him for a long time at the airport, her face pressed against his shoulder, and he'd felt how much she was holding in on his behalf, and he'd been grateful for it and ashamed of it in equal measure. That had been the fall. Now it was February, and the lake was a white field, and there was a dog on the other side of the tree line. He saw her first through the window, a dark shape against the snow moving wrong. Not the loosed trot of a dog out for a run. Something heavier. Something careful, like she was carrying something she couldn't afford to drop. Sean pulled on his jacket without thinking about it. His boots were by the door. He laced them standing up, which he hadn't done since his toot, and stepped out into air that hit like a wet towel left in a freezer. -22. Maybe colder with the wind off the lake. He found her at the edge of the property, just inside the tree line, where the pines grew thick enough to break the wind. She was a medium-sized dog, some mix he couldn't immediately place, mostly black with rust-colored patches above each eye, ears that couldn't decide whether to stand up or fold over. A working dog's body. Compact, dense, built for something. She looked up at him without backing away, which was either bravery or exhaustion, and he suspected it was both. She was shivering so hard her lips vibrated. At her feet, tucked against her belly and against each other, were 2 puppies. They were small enough that Sean could have held both in one hand. They were not shivering because she was keeping them warm, angling her body between them and the wind, with the kind of precise, deliberate positioning he recognized from a different context entirely. She had found the best available cover. She had assessed the terrain. She was doing everything right with nothing to work with. "Okay," he said, which was not a thing he'd planned to say. He crouched down. She watched him. Her eyes were amber, clear, and direct in a way that reminded him, faintly and unexpectedly, of certain men he'd served with, the ones who had seen enough not to waste energy on performance. He held out his hand, knuckles first, and waited. She smelled him for a long time. Then she put her chin on his wrist. That was all it took. He carried the puppies inside in his jacket pockets. She walked beside him, close enough that her shoulder occasionally pressed against his leg, not leaning, just present. He got the sense she was not a dog who leaned. She was a dog who chose proximity as a form of statement. In the cabin, he put the puppies in a cardboard box near the wood stove, with a folded wool blanket Karen had bought at a market in Tobermory 2 summers ago. He hadn't been able to put it away. It had just stayed on the chair. He was glad of it now. The mother dog, He did not name her yet, because naming felt like a decision and he wasn't making decisions. Sat beside the box and watched him fill a mixing bowl with water and another with the dog food he'd kept buying out of muscle memory. She drank for a long time. She ate carefully, not frantically, keeping one eye on the box. When she was done, she stepped into the box, turned around once, and lay down around her puppies with a heaviness that was not defeat. It was relief. Sean sat down on the floor across from the stove, his back against the couch, and watched the fire. He hadn't sat on the floor since he couldn't remember, since he was a kid, maybe. It felt strange, and then it felt fine. He started calling her Rue. Not for any reason he could have explained cleanly. It was just a sound that fit her, short, a little rough at the edges. She responded to it by the second day, which meant either she'd had a name like it before, or she was simply faster than he expected. The puppies were a boy and a girl. He called them Small and Smaller, which was accurate, and which he told himself was temporary. It wasn't temporary. He started talking to them more than he'd intended. Not long conversations, just the running commentary that comes from being alone with living things that need things from you at regular intervals. Water. You need water. How do you need this much water? He found himself explaining things. The way the ice on the lake changed color depending on the light. How to read the sky for incoming weather. Why the wood stacked against the south wall burned longer than the wood against the north wall. Something to do with exposure. Rue would sit across from him and watch him talk with an expression of focused patience that made him feel, absurdly, like he should be saying something more useful. He started sleeping more than he had in months. 8 hours, sometimes 9. He hadn't done that since before the diagnosis. He didn't examine it too closely. The neighbor was named Alistair Boone. No, Boone was on the list. The neighbor was named Alistair Crane. Alistair was 71 years old and had the build of a man who had once been very large and had gradually become merely substantial. He lived in the property to the north year-round, and he drove a truck that was older than some of Sean's former teammates. He knocked on the door on a Thursday morning, which Sean knew only because he'd checked his phone to confirm. "Saw smoke from your chimney," Alistair said. "Figured I'd check." He was holding a covered pot. Sean could smell something with onions in it. "I'm fine," Sean said. "Didn't say you weren't." Alistair looked past him into the cabin with the calm curiosity of a man who had been around long enough to feel entitled to look. "That a dog?" Rue had appeared at Sean's leg. She was doing the shoulder proximity thing. Sean had started to think of it as her version of endorsement. 2 dogs, Sean said, and 2 puppies. Alistair's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "That's so." He held up the pot. "I made too much soup." Sean stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was polite. Then he stepped back. Alistair Crane had retired from the Ontario Provincial Police after 34 years. He had a daughter in Peterborough who called every Sunday, and a son in Vancouver who called when he remembered. He had a dog of his own, an elderly beagle named Carl, who slept for approximately 22 hours a day and snored through the remaining 2. He had come to the lake property 11 years ago, after his wife Diane had died, because it was where they'd planned to retire together, and he hadn't been able to think of anywhere else to go. He said most of this in the way men like him say things, not as disclosure, but as fact, as orientation. "Here is where I am standing so you know where to find me." Sean found he didn't mind it. They ate soup at the kitchen table, which Sean had been using mostly as a surface for stacking things. Rue lay under the table. The puppies slept in their box. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, slow pulses like something breathing. Alistair looked at Rue and said, "She find you or you find her. She was at the tree line 2 days ago, -22. Alistair was quiet for a moment, turning his spoon. "How long you been out here? Since October?" Alistair nodded. He didn't say alone or by yourself. He just nodded. And there was something in the nod that acknowledged a thing without requiring it to be named, and Sean was more grateful for that than he had words for. "You were military," Alistair said. "Not a question. 22 years. Do anything I'd recognize? Probably not fair." Alistair picked up his bowl. "Diane used to say I asked too many questions. Occupational hazard." He paused. Shion watched him eat. "Karen," he said. "My wife. February of last year." Alistair set down his bowl. He didn't say I'm sorry or she's in a better place or any of the other things people said that sealed the subject shut like a door. He said, "What was she like?" And Sean, who had not talked about Karen to anyone since the funeral, sat for a moment in the particular silence of a question he hadn't been asked, and then he started to talk. She had been a landscape architect. She had grown up in Brampton, which she claimed had prepared her for the indignity of every difficult situation she'd ever faced. She had been exactly 5 feet 3 inches tall and had never once acknowledged this as a limitation. She had a laugh that started quietly and then escaped its own intentions, getting bigger than she'd planned for, and she was always slightly surprised by it, which made it better. She had been more patient than he deserved and less patient than she pretended, and she had loved the lake property fiercely and in a specific way, not for its peace, but for the particular quality of its noise. The loons, the wind, the ice moving and settling in February. He had not been back here since before the diagnosis. He hadn't been able to. He had driven past the turnoff on the highway once and had kept driving for 6 hours before he pulled over and sat in a parking lot in Sudbury until he could make himself turn around. He had finally come in October because he'd run out of other places to go, and because Karen had always said February on the lake was something you had to hear at least once. He'd been meaning to leave before February. He was still here. "She sounds like someone who knew what she wanted," Alistair said. "She always did." Diane was like that, decisive. "I used to take 3 days to pick a paint color. She'd walk in, point, done." He looked out the window. "I've been here 11 years and I still can't pick a paint color without her." The wood stove ticked. Rue's ear moved in her sleep. "The dog," Alistair said. "She got a name? Rue? And the puppies?" Sean looked at the box. Small was sprawled on his back in the way only puppies and the fully unconscious can manage. Smaller had her nose tucked under her mother's chin. "Small and smaller," he said. Alistair considered this. "You planning to keep them?" "It was not exactly a question. I haven't decided," Sean said. Alistair picked up his bowl again. "No rush," he said in the tone of someone who had already seen how this ended. "February is a long month in Halliburton County. Not in days. It's the shortest month, but in the quality of its presence. It settles in, it doesn't hurry. The light stays low and blue until almost 9, then spends the day moving sideways across the snow, and in the late afternoon it turns a color that has no name in the standard vocabulary, something between copper and sorrow, and it lasts for about 40 minutes before the dark comes in from the east and takes everything." Sean started going outside more, not for any destination, just out. Rue came with him always. The puppies stayed in the box until they were big enough to follow, which happened faster than seemed possible, and then all 3 came. The puppies struggled through the snow with a comic, wholehearted effort that made Sean feel something in his chest he hadn't felt in over a year. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something older and simpler. Something like this is happening, and I am here for it. He started noticing things, the way the ice made sounds at night, deep, structural sounds, the lake adjusting to temperature changes in its depths. The tracks in the snow outside the tree line. Fox, he thought. Maybe coyote to the north near the creek. The particular way Rue watched the water. The stillness of her body when she watched it, like she was reading something he didn't have the language for yet. He thought about Karen. He always thought about Karen. But the quality of the thinking started to change. Less like pressing a bruise. More like holding something that was both fragile and solid at once. A photograph, maybe, or a letter on paper that had gone soft with handling. He thought about her standing on the dock in July before everything, wearing his old SEAL training t-shirt, which was too big, and complaining about the horseflies with vocabulary she usually reserved for very bad drivers. He thought about how she had turned around and caught him watching her and had said, "Don't you dare," because she knew he was about to say something sincere, and she couldn't always handle sincere before noon. He laughed, out loud, standing by the lake in February, with 3 dogs watching him and no one else around for half a kilometer. It didn't sound like his voice. It sounded like his voice when he was younger. Alistair came back the following Thursday. Then the Thursday after that, he started bringing things. Fresh bread from a bakery in Minden once. A better axe head for the one Sean had noticed was working loose. Nothing that required acknowledgement or reciprocity. He came, he stayed for an hour or two, he left. He brought Carl, the elderly beagle, who was unbothered by Rue and condescending toward the puppies, in the way of very old dogs with very old dignity. Alistair told him about the lake in other seasons, where to fish in June, the spot near the western point where the bass came in, the loons, same pair, or their offspring, he couldn't say for certain, that had been nesting on the east side of the island for as long as he'd been coming here. He told him about the winter that the ice came in wrong, and didn't freeze solid until January and everyone with a snowmobile had to wait, and how the silence after the ice finally settled was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. He told him about Diane, not a lot and not all at once, the way you add wood to a fire, a piece at a time, so it doesn't smother. Sean told him about Karen the same way. The telling did something that Sean hadn't expected. Not comfort. He had been suspicious of comfort for a long time, the way it softened things that maybe needed to stay sharp. But something more like testimony. Like saying the name of a place makes it real on the map. Karen existed more fully in the telling. She was there in the room when he talked about her, in the way a person is there when they're the reason the conversation exists at all. In the third week of February, Smaller got sick. It was fast and frightening in the way illness in small animals always is. One morning she was fine, chasing her brother with complete seriousness, and by afternoon she was still and hot in the corner of the box, her breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. Rue lay pressed against her without moving. It was the only time Sean had seen her fully abandon her composure, and the quality of her stillness next to the puppy was not calm. It was vigil. He called the vet in Minden with the phone he'd barely touched in weeks. He drove the truck down the highway he hadn't driven since October, Smaller wrapped in Karen's blanket on the passenger seat, Rue in the back seat with her chin on the console watching. The vet was a woman in her early 40s named Dr. Ashby. Practical and direct in a way Sean respected. She diagnosed a respiratory infection. Common in young puppies, treatable. She gave him medication and instructions with the precision of someone who had given them many times and had learned which parts people forgot. "She'll be okay," she said. "But you'll need to watch her for the next few days." He watched her. He barely slept. Rue barely slept. Small, confused by the disruption, stayed close to his mother and watched both Sean and the sick puppy with a young dog's uncomprehending concern. On the third day, Smaller stood up in the box, walked to the water bowl, and drank sloppily and with full commitment. Sean sat down on the kitchen floor again. He put his face in his hands, not crying, or not only that, something less specific. Some kind of pressure releasing that had been building since before February, before October, maybe since before Karen got sick, the particular pressure of a person who has spent a very long time keeping things together by force of will alone. Rue left the box and came and sat in front of him. She put her head on his knee. He stayed on the floor for a while. By March, the light was coming differently. Still cold, but with a quality of intention it hadn't had before. A slant that suggested the sun was beginning to mean it. Sean called Priya. She picked up before the second ring, which told him everything about how she'd been spending the past months, and he felt it in his sternum. "Hey, kid, Dad." Her voice had that controlled quality it got when she was managing herself, then it relaxed. "Hey." He told her about Rue, about the puppies, about Alistair, the retired OPP officer, who brought bread on Thursdays and talked about his dead wife, like she was a part of the lake that was just currently out of sight. He told her about the ice sounds at night, about Small learning to open the cupboard under the sink, which was as impressive as it was inconvenient, about February, the particular color of it in the afternoon, and how Karen had been right that it was something you needed to hear. Priya was quiet for a moment after he stopped talking. "You sound different," she said. "How?" "Like yourself." She paused. "Like the before version." He looked at Rue, who was lying across the threshold of the back door, apparently committed to monitoring both the inside and outside of the cabin simultaneously. "I'm keeping the dogs," he said. "I know you are. I might stay for spring. Dad, just stay." He looked out at the lake. The ice was starting to show its age in the way February ice does when it knows March is coming. A slight softening at the surface, a change in the sound the wind made across it, less like a struck bell and more like a held note. "Karen would have had opinions about the dogs," he said. Priya laughed. She would have had opinions about the dog's opinions. She would have named them better. She named everything better than you. This was true. He held on to it. He did stay for spring. On the last weekend of March, Alistair came over with a bottle of something from a small distillery in Prince Edward County, and they sat on the dock in the cold. Cold enough to see your breath, warm enough to feel the sun on the back of your hands, and drank without hurrying, watching the ice release its hold on the lake inch by inch, the water appearing in dark strips along the shore first, then spreading. The puppies had stopped being small enough to hold in one hand somewhere in the past month. Small was going to be large. Smaller, despite her name, was going to be larger. Rue sat between Sean and the edge of the dock, her eyes on the water, measuring. "You'll come back next winter," Alistair said. It was not exactly a question either. "Yeah," Sean said. "I'll come back." Alistair turned his glass in his hand, watching the water. Across the lake, something moved at the tree line. A deer, maybe. The far shore was beginning to show brown through the snow where the slope caught the sun. "Diane would have liked you," he said. Sean considered the weight of that. "Karen would have liked you," he said. "She liked people who said what they meant. She would have thought I was nosy. She would have thought you were nosy and liked you anyway." The ice made a sound then, a long, low note from somewhere under the surface, the lake doing what lakes do at the end of a hard winter, settling into itself, finding what it was now that the cold had done what it came to do and was beginning finally to let go. Sean raised his glass. He wasn't sure exactly what he was toasting. The dogs, maybe. The neighbor who had come with soup and stayed for winter. Karen, who had told him February on this lake was worth hearing at least once and had, as usual, known exactly what she was talking about. All of it. He was toasting all of it. Rue put her head on his knee. Small flopped sideways onto Alistair's boots, apparently boneless. Smaller sat at the edge of the dock and watched the open water with her mother's eyes, amber, clear, and absolutely sure of what she was looking at. The last of the ice moved. The lake opened, and somewhere in the pines, a loon called, and the sound went out across the water like a door someone had finally decided to leave open.